I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one Thomas bought me 43 years ago, with the worn velvet arms where my hands always rest, when my phone lit up with a video call from Richard, and within 5 minutes, my entire world shattered into pieces so small I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to put them back together again. They were all there on the screen, my son and his wife Claire, my 2 grandchildren Madison and Ethan, dressed in their finest clothes like they were at some fancy celebration. And Richard looked right into the camera with eyes that had suddenly become a stranger's eyes and told me I wasn't part of their new life anymore. That I was embarrassing, old-fashioned, not the right kind of person for their new chapter. And then, this is what broke me completely. My sweet Ethan, the boy I'd held when he was hours old, leaned forward and called me an embarrassment before they all said goodbye and ended the call, blocking me from their lives as easily as deleting an old contact. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm 82 years old now, though on that Sunday evening I felt about 1,000. I want to tell you this story the way it really happened, not the way I wished it had happened, because sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set you free, even when it hurts more than you ever thought possible. Let me take you back a bit, so you understand how I got to that armchair, to that phone call, to that moment when everything I'd built my entire life around simply vanished. I've lived in this little house in Willow Creek for 55 years. Thomas and I moved here as newlyweds, back when the neighborhood was brand new and full of young couples just like us, planting saplings that are now towering oaks. He was a good man, my Thomas, steady, kind, the sort of person who fixed neighbors' fences without being asked and always had a joke ready to make you smile. We had one child, our Richard, and I poured everything I had into raising him right after Thomas passed away 18 years ago from a heart attack that took him so suddenly I didn't even get to say goodbye. Those years alone were hard in ways I don't talk about much. I worked nights cleaning offices downtown, my knees aching on those cold tile floors, then waited tables on weekends at the diner on Maple Street where the cook always saved me the day-old bread to take home. Every penny I earned went into envelopes I kept in my bedroom drawer. One for Richard's college fund, one for emergencies, one for the future I wanted him to have. I wanted him to have opportunities, Thomas, and I never did, you see. I wanted him to walk through doors that had been closed to us. And he did walk through those doors. Richard went to a good university. I paid every cent of tuition, working double shifts and skipping meals I told myself I wasn't hungry for anyway. He graduated, met Claire at some corporate mixer, and they had a beautiful wedding that cost me my entire savings account. Though I smiled through every minute of it because that's what mothers do. We celebrate our children's joy even when our bank accounts weep. Then came the house, the first one, where they needed help with the down payment because young couples starting out need a leg up, don't they? I cashed in bonds I'd been saving since Thomas died. Told Richard it was no problem at all. Watched him and Claire move into that sweet little starter home with the blue shutters. 2 years later, they wanted to upgrade. Needed to, Claire said, because they were expecting Madison and the neighborhood wasn't quite right. So I helped again, this time with money I'd been setting aside for the new roof I needed, which I learned to patch myself with YouTube videos and prayers. Madison came first, and oh, what a beautiful baby she was. I held her in the hospital and felt my heart grow 3 sizes, just like in that children's book I used to read to Richard. Then Ethan arrived 3 years later, and my life became weekends with 2 giggling grandchildren who called me Grandma Evie and asked me to make my special chocolate chip cookies every single visit. I kept their artwork on my refrigerator, bought them books and clothes and toys, and quietly deposited money into college funds I'd opened in their names, funds their parents knew nothing about because I wanted them to have the same chances I'd given Richard. When Richard's business hit rough patches, and it hit them twice, hard enough that he came to me with panic in his eyes, I cashed in my retirement bonds. Both times. The first time was $12,000 to cover payroll, when a client defaulted. The second time was $18,000 to settle a lawsuit that threatened everything. I told him it was money I didn't need, that Thomas would have wanted me to help, that family takes care of family. What I didn't tell him was that I'd planned to use that money to finally fix the plumbing that groaned and rattled every winter, or to replace the furnace that was held together mostly by duct tape and hope. I wore the same coat for 14 years. I cut my own hair. I bought dented cans at the discount grocery store, and told myself the food tasted just fine. None of it mattered because my son was thriving, and my grandchildren were happy, and every Sunday they called me, every holiday they visited, every birthday I got handmade cards and tight hugs that made every sacrifice feel like nothing at all. Then Richard got his big promotion 2 years ago. Vice president of something important at some company I could never quite remember the name of. The salary was extraordinary, he told me on the phone, his voice electric with excitement. They were moving 3 states away to a city I'd never been to, into a gated community with a pool and marble countertops and neighbors who mattered. This was their chance, he said. Their fresh start. Their dream life. I told him I was proud. I told him I understood. I helped them pack, watched the moving truck pull away from the house I'd helped them buy, and waved until they turned the corner and disappeared. The Sunday calls started coming less frequently after that. Madison was busy with college applications. Ethan had lacrosse tournaments. Richard and Claire were settling into their new social circle. Country club memberships, charity galas, tennis lessons. I understood. I really did. Young people have lives to live, and I was just the grandmother in the little house 3 states away. But I missed them with an ache that lived in my chest like a stone. I sent care packages they never acknowledged. I texted photos they never responded to. I called and got voicemail. Left messages that went unreturned. The last time I actually spoke to Madison was 4 months before that video call, when she picked up by accident and said she couldn't talk. She was getting ready for some event. Could I call back later? I called back later. She didn't answer. I told myself they were just adjusting, building their new life, finding their rhythm. I told myself I was being needy, that modern grandmothers give their families space, that I should be grateful for the years I'd had instead of greedy for more. Then came that Sunday evening in October when my phone rang with a video call from Richard, and I answered so fast I nearly dropped it, so hungry for their faces, so ready to hear their voices. They were all there, dressed up and beautiful, and for one wonderful second I thought they were calling to share some good news, some celebration, maybe to tell me they were coming to visit. Richard spoke first, his voice formal and careful, like he'd practiced the words. He said they needed to be honest with me. Direct. He said I wasn't part of their new life anymore, that they were in a different chapter now with private schools and the right kind of people, and they couldn't keep dragging the past, meaning me, along with them. He asked me to respect their boundaries and not reach out unless they contacted me first. I sat in that chair until the sun came up, watching the darkness outside my window gradually turn gray, then pink, then gold, and the whole time I kept thinking this must be some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that would clear itself up if I just waited long enough, if I just stayed still and quiet and didn't make things worse by reaching out. My phone sat on my lap like a dead weight, and every few minutes I'd look at it, half expecting an apology text to appear, some message saying they'd been drinking or joking or testing me somehow. But the screen stayed dark and empty, and the silence grew heavier with each passing hour. By the time the morning light filled my living room, I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that no apology was coming, that they'd meant every single word, that I'd been weighed and measured against their new life and found wanting. I want you to understand what that kind of rejection does to a person, especially when you're my age and you've spent your whole life believing that family is everything, that the love you give will somehow circle back to you when you need it most. I'd read articles about older people being abandoned by their children, seen stories on the news about nursing homes full of forgotten grandparents, but I'd always thought those were other people's families, other people's tragedies. My Richard loved me. My grandchildren adored me. We had history together, memories, bonds that couldn't be broken. Except they could be broken. They had been broken. And I was the only one who hadn't seen it coming. I tried to remember when things had started to change, when the warmth had begun to cool. Was it after the promotion? Or had it started earlier, So gradually I hadn't noticed until it was too late? I thought about Claire's increasingly brief responses to my texts, Madison's excuses about being too busy to video chat, Ethan's vague answers when I asked about school. I told myself it was normal, that families grow and change and people get caught up in their own lives. But now I wondered if I'd been willfully blind, if I'd ignored warning signs because I couldn't bear to see them. The house felt different that morning, like it had grown larger and emptier overnight. Every room held memories that suddenly felt painful. The kitchen where I'd taught Madison to bake cookies, the guest bedroom where Ethan used to sleep when he visited, the dining room table where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sundays that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now glowed in my memory like precious gems I hadn't appreciated until they were gone. I found myself walking through the house, touching things. The crayon marks on the hallway wall that I'd never painted over because they were from when Richard was 5. The framed drawings Madison had made me in 2nd grade. The photograph on the mantel from Ethan's high school graduation, where I stood between my grandchildren with my arms around them both. All of us smiling like we had forever. I'd paid for that graduation party, I remembered suddenly. Paid for the catering and the tent and the cake, and Richard had thanked me with a hug and said he didn't know what he'd do without me. Apparently, he'd figured it out. I spent the first few days in a fog of grief that felt almost physical, like I was moving through water. I couldn't eat. Food tasted like cardboard and stuck in my throat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces on that video call, heard their words echoing in the dark. I kept picking up my phone to call Richard, to text Madison, to somehow fix whatever had broken between us, but then I'd remember that they'd blocked me, that they'd explicitly told me not to reach out, that any attempt to contact them would be violating the boundaries they'd set. So I did nothing. I sat with my pain and my confusion and my growing anger. Because yes, I was angry, even though I felt guilty about being angry, even though I told myself that good grandmothers don't get angry at their families no matter what. My neighbor Susan knocked on my door the 3rd day, carrying a casserole and a concerned expression. She'd noticed I hadn't been getting my mail, hadn't been sitting on my porch in the evenings like I usually did. Was everything all right? I told her I was fine, just a bit under the weather. And late one night, about a week after the call, I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I went to the computer Thomas had bought me years ago, the one I mostly used for email and looking up recipes, and I searched for Richard's new address. It wasn't hard to find. He'd posted photos of their new house on social media before blocking me, and the location tag was still visible in the cached pages. I looked at pictures of their gated community, their marble countertops, their pool that sparkled in the sunshine, and I saw other photos too, photos of them at parties and restaurants and charity events, all dressed up and smiling, living their dream life without a single visible gap where I used to be. There was even a photo of their new boat, a gleaming white thing tied up at some marina, and the name painted on the side made my stomach drop. Future Inheritance. They'd named their boat Future Inheritance. They'd been counting on money they assumed would come to them, spending it in their heads before I was even gone. And I realized with a sick jolt that maybe my value to them had always been partially financial, that maybe the love I'd thought was unconditional had always had a price tag I'd been too naive to see. I closed the computer and sat in the dark, and something shifted inside me that night. The grief was still there, sharp and aching, but underneath it was something harder, something that felt like bedrock after years of quicksand. I'd spent my whole life giving. I'd sacrificed my comfort, my savings, my future for people who apparently saw me as an embarrassment, an outdated relic they could discard once they didn't need my money anymore. Well, I thought maybe it was time to stop giving. Maybe it was time to see what happened when I finally kept something for myself. I didn't know yet what that meant or what I was going to do. But I knew I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life waiting for scraps of affection from people who'd made it clear I wasn't wanted. I'd spent 8 decades being what other people needed. Maybe I could spend whatever time I had left figuring out what I needed. The next morning, I got up and made myself breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs and toast and coffee I actually tasted. I showered and dressed and went outside to get my mail, and the sunshine felt warmer than it had in days. I wasn't okay yet. I wasn't healed, but I was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. I'd survived losing Thomas. I'd survived poverty and loneliness and exhaustion. I could survive being abandoned too. I just wasn't sure yet who I'd be on the other side. The idea came to me on a Tuesday morning while I was sorting through the cedar chest in my bedroom, the one that had belonged to Thomas's mother, and still smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender. I'd been looking for my wedding photos. Don't ask me why, maybe I just needed to remember a time when love felt simple and promises meant something. When my hand brushed against a bundle of old letters tied with a faded ribbon, letters I'd forgotten were even there. They were from Thomas's Aunt Beatrice, written in the careful, elegant script of someone who'd been educated in a different era, when penmanship was an art and words were chosen with care. I'd only met Beatrice once, at our wedding, a tall, dignified woman in pearls who'd given us a silver tea service and a knowing smile that I hadn't understood at the time. She'd died a few months later, and Thomas had been sad but not devastated. She'd been his great-aunt, after all, not someone he'd known well, and his father had always spoken of her in vague terms that suggested complicated family dynamics better left unexamined. But as I sat there on my bedroom floor reading those letters, I began to see threads of something I'd never noticed before. References to our special boy, and the truth we keep, and provisions I've made for his future. There was one letter in particular that made my hands shake as I read it, dated just months before Beatrice died, where she wrote to Thomas's mother about how, when the time is right, everything will be revealed, and Thomas will understand why I've loved him as my own. I'd always assumed it was just the affection of a childless woman for her nephew, but now those words felt weighted with meaning I'd missed, heavy with secrets that had been buried with the people who'd known them. I spent the rest of that day going through everything Thomas had left behind. Boxes of papers from his childhood home, old photographs with names written on the back in ink that had faded to brown, a family Bible with birth dates that suddenly seemed important in ways I'd never considered. Thomas's father had died when Thomas was young, and his mother had raised him alone, just as I'd raised Richard. And I'd thought we had that in common, that shared experience of single parenthood. But what if there was more to the story? What if the reason Thomas's mother had been alone wasn't what I'd always assumed? I'm not a suspicious person by nature, and I'd never been one for family drama or conspiracy theories, but something in those letters called to me, whispered that maybe there were answers hidden in the past, answers that might matter now in ways I couldn't yet understand. Maybe I was just looking for distraction from my grief, or maybe I was searching for any connection to family after losing the one I'd thought was mine. But whatever the reason, I found myself pulling out the phone book. Yes, I still have one of those, and looking up genealogists. The woman I found was named Patricia Chun, and she worked out of an office 40 minutes away in the city. When I called and explained what I wanted, that I wanted to understand my late husband's family history, that I had documents and letters and questions that needed answers, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. She said that family mysteries were her specialty, that the stories we think we know are often only the surfaces of deeper truths, and that if I was ready to learn what was really there, she would help me find it. I told her I was ready. I wasn't sure that was true, but I said it anyway. The first meeting with Patricia was in her small, cluttered office that smelled of old paper and strong tea. I brought everything I'd found: the letters, the photographs, the family Bible, certificates and documents that Thomas had kept in a lockbox I'd never fully explored. She handled each item with careful reverence, making notes in a leather journal, asking questions about dates and names and relationships I'd never thought to question before. When I mentioned Beatrice Langford and the strange phrasing in her letters, Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, and she asked me to repeat the surname. Langford, I said. Beatrice Langford. She'd owned property, I knew that much, rental buildings downtown that had been sold after her death, though I'd never known the details because Thomas's family didn't talk much about money, considered it impolite. Patricia typed something into her computer, and her expression shifted into what I can only describe as focused intensity. She asked if I knew that Beatrice Langford had been one of the wealthiest women in the county in her time, that she'd inherited commercial real estate from her father, and built an empire at a time when women weren't supposed to be capable of such things. I didn't know. Thomas had never mentioned it, or if he had, I hadn't understood the significance. What I also didn't know, what nobody had ever told me, was that Beatrice had never married, never had acknowledged children, and had died with a will that created a complex trust, the details of which had been sealed by lawyers and family discretion for decades. Patricia asked if she could do some deeper research, if I'd be willing to pay for document searches and possibly DNA analysis if it came to that. The cost made me wince. My budget was tight after years of giving everything away, but something in me needed to know the truth, needed to understand the story that had been hidden all these years. I told her yes. I told her to find whatever there was to find. The weeks that followed were strange ones. I'd go about my daily life, shopping, cleaning, tending my small garden, and then I'd come home to emails from Patricia with attachments full of old census records, property deeds, newspaper clippings about Beatrice Langford's business dealings and charitable works. I learned that she'd been a formidable woman, that she'd never suffered fools, that she'd been known for her sharp mind and her fierce protection of what was hers. I learned other things too, pieced together from birth certificates that didn't quite match the family story, from dates that didn't align, from a photograph Patricia found in a historical archive that showed Beatrice holding a baby boy with an expression that no aunt, no matter how devoted, would have on her face. That was a mother's look. I'd worn it myself when they'd placed Richard in my arms for the first time. When Patricia finally called me into her office for what she called the full briefing, I knew before she spoke that everything I'd believed about Thomas's family was about to change. She had documents spread across her desk, some of them so old they were brown at the edges, and she'd organized them into a timeline that told a story I'd never imagined. Thomas wasn't the biological son of the man who'd raised him. He was Beatrice's child, born in secret at a time when unwed motherhood would have destroyed her reputation and her business empire. Her younger sister, the woman Thomas had called mother, had agreed to raise him as her own, to give him legitimacy and a normal life, while Beatrice remained the doting aunt who provided quietly from the shadows. The man listed as Thomas's father on his birth certificate had been complicit in the arrangement, had given the child his name in exchange for financial security Beatrice provided. And when he died young, Beatrice had simply increased the payments to her sister, ensuring Thomas wanted for nothing. And when Beatrice had died, she'd created a trust, an ironclad legal structure that would protect her true son and his descendants, that would ensure her wealth went to her bloodline as long as certain conditions were met. Patricia showed me the document, authenticated and verified, written in legal language that took time to parse but eventually became clear. The fortune only passed to descendants who actively honored and included the surviving matriarch. That was me now. I was the matriarch, Thomas's widow, the trustee who held the power to determine who received what. And if any heir formally abandoned or disavowed me, if they stated clearly and unequivocally that I was not part of their life, that entire branch would be cut out permanently, and the assets would revert to charitable beneficiaries Beatrice had named in 1951. Patricia had done more than just historical research. She'd hired lawyers to verify the trust's current standing, had confirmed that it was still legally binding, had even gotten appraisals on the properties and investments that had grown substantially over the decades. The current value, she told me in a voice that was carefully neutral, was approximately $6.2 million. I sat in that office chair and felt the room tilt slightly. $6 million. Money that Richard had no idea existed. Money that Thomas himself might not have fully understood. Money that had been waiting all these years for circumstances just like these. Patricia asked if I wanted to pursue activation of the trust, if I wanted to claim my position as trustee and enforce the terms Beatrice had set down. She asked gently, kindly, as if she understood that this was more than just a legal question, that it was about family and betrayal and wounds that were still bleeding. I thought about that video call, about their faces and their words, and the way they discarded me like trash they were finally free to throw away. I thought about the boat named Future Inheritance, and the deposits they'd already made on Ivy League educations funded by money they assumed was coming. I told Patricia yes. I told her to activate everything, to document everything, to make it official and legal and unbreakable. Patricia worked with the precision of a surgeon, and the determination of someone who'd seen too many families underestimate the power of legal documents written by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Within 3 weeks, she'd assembled a file so comprehensive that it would take a team of lawyers months to even attempt to challenge it. And she'd made it clear to me that they wouldn't succeed because Beatrice Langford had been nothing if not thorough, and the trust she'd created was a fortress built with the kind of money that buys the very best legal minds. The DNA testing was Patricia's idea, a way to remove any possible doubt about Thomas's parentage, and therefore Richard's claim to the bloodline. I gave a sample easily enough, just a swab inside my cheek, and Patricia explained that she'd already obtained samples from Thomas's personal effects, hair from a brush I'd kept all these years, and that she could cross-reference everything against genealogical databases and historical records. When the results came back, they confirmed what the documents had already shown. Thomas was indeed Beatrice's biological son, which made Richard her grandson, which made Madison and Ethan her great-great-grandchildren, which meant they were all covered by the trust's provisions. All covered by the abandonment clause too. I had Patricia include everything in the packet I was going to send to Richard. The full family tree showing the true bloodline, the DNA reports with their official stamps and certifications, the original 1951 trust document that Beatrice had signed in her elegant handwriting, property deeds showing what she'd owned then, and what it had grown into now, appraisals that put a dollar amount on their future that they'd just thrown away. But the centerpiece, the thing I knew would hit hardest, was the transcript. I'd recorded that video call, you see. Some instinct I didn't fully understand had made me press the record button on my phone before answering. Maybe because video calls from Richard had become so rare that I wanted to preserve it. Or maybe because some part of me already knew that something was wrong and I'd need proof later. I'd listened to it only once after that terrible night, forcing myself to hear their words again, their exact phrasing, the casual cruelty in their voices, And then I'd saved it to 3 different places because I understood even then that this recording was important, that it was evidence of something I couldn't quite name yet. Patricia had it transcribed by a professional service, every word captured in black text on white paper, and reading it was somehow worse than hearing it had been. When words are spoken, you can tell yourself maybe you misunderstood. Maybe the tone was different than you remember, maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. But when words are written down, when you can see them stark and permanent on a page, there's no room for doubt or softening or hopeful reinterpretation. You're not part of our new life anymore, Grandma. Richard's words. We don't want the kids confused by older influences. Claire's contribution. You're kind of embarrassing with the old clothes and the small-town stories. Ethan's cruelty. Don't make this weird. Madison's dismissal. I wrote the cover letter myself, though Patricia offered to help. I wanted it in my own words. Wanted them to hear my voice even in written form. I kept it simple and factual, no dramatics or emotional appeals, just a clear explanation of what they'd triggered and what it meant. I quoted their words back to them. I explained that their recorded statement that I was not part of their new life, combined with their subsequent total abandonment, blocking me on every platform, refusing all contact, constituted a formal disavowal under the terms of the trust. I informed them that they, their spouse, and their descendants were now permanently excluded from the inheritance. I noted that the estate would transfer to the designated charitable beneficiaries within 60 days, as stipulated in Beatrice's original document. I signed it Evelyn Harper, trustee of the Langford estate, and I felt something settle in my chest as I wrote those words, something that might have been power or might have been grief or might have been both at once. I didn't have to imagine what happened after they opened it, though, because they made sure I knew. The first call came 3 hours after delivery. I didn't answer. They were still blocked, so it went straight to voicemail, but I could see the notification, could see that Richard had tried to reach me. Then Claire tried. Then Richard again. By the end of that first day, I had 83 missed calls, and I listened to none of the voicemails because I didn't need to hear their panic to know it was there. The emails started next, bypassing the blocks somehow through different accounts, subject lines that screamed urgency and desperation. "Mom, please call. We need to talk immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." I deleted them without reading past the first lines. Patricia had advised me not to engage, had explained that anything I said now could potentially be used to argue that I was willing to reconsider, that the abandonment hadn't been as total as the trust required, and I wasn't about to give them any opening to slither back into a fortune they'd already rejected along with me. On the 3rd day after they received the packet, Richard showed up at my house. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the car door slam, heard the footsteps running up my front walk, heard the desperate pounding on my door that made my heart race even as I told myself I didn't have to answer, didn't owe him anything, could simply wait until he left. But I looked through the front window, and what I saw stopped me cold. Richard's face was pale, drained of color in a way that made him look a decade older than his 47 years. Claire sat in the car, and even from a distance I could see that she was crying, her shoulders shaking. Madison and Ethan were in the back seat, and they looked like ghosts, like people who'd just watched their entire future evaporate and didn't know how to comprehend what had happened. Richard fell to his knees on my porch. Actually fell to his knees like something from a dramatic movie. Except this was real and happening on my weathered wooden boards, and he pressed his face against my door and called out, "Mom, please, it was just talk. We didn't mean it literally. You have to give us a chance to explain." I stood in my living room and watched my son beg, and I felt absolutely nothing. That's what surprised me most. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even sadness, just a vast emptiness where my feelings for him used to live. This was the boy I'd rocked through colic and walked through nightmares. The teenager I'd helped with homework and driven to practices. The young man I'd supported through every failure and celebrated through every success. And now he was a stranger kneeling on my porch because he'd finally realized that the money he'd been counting on, the future he'd been spending in his imagination, was gone forever. Claire got out of the car then, stumbling toward the porch in expensive heels that weren't meant for my cracked walkway, and I heard her wail, "We already put deposits on the kids' Ivy League funds with the money we thought." And she stopped herself, But not soon enough, and I understood with perfect clarity that they'd been borrowing against an inheritance they'd assumed was assured, that they'd built their dream life on the foundation of my eventual death, and the wealth that would flow to them afterward. Ethan appeared beside his father, and I could see that he'd been crying, his eyes red and swollen. His voice cracked when he called out, "Grandma, I'm sorry about the embarrassing thing. I take it all back. Please, can we just talk?" And there was such desperation in his tone, such obvious fear, that I almost felt something, almost felt a crack in the ice that had formed around my heart. Almost, but not quite. I waited until they'd all said their piece, until they'd exhausted themselves with pleading and explaining and bargaining. And then I opened my door just enough to step out onto the porch. They all looked up at me with faces full of hope and terror mixed together, like I was some deity who might grant mercy or might not, whose decision would determine everything. I looked at my grandson, the sweet boy who'd called me an embarrassment, and I spoke quietly but clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. "You made your new life without me," I said. "Now live in it." Then I handed Richard a folder I'd prepared, copies of the trust documents and the activation paperwork, and I watched his face as he opened it and understood, really understood for the first time, that this wasn't a negotiation or a misunderstanding or something that could be fixed with apologies and promises. This was done. This was final. This was the consequence of treating someone as disposable when they'd given you everything. They left eventually, when it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind, that no amount of begging or tears or explanations would alter what they'd set in motion themselves. I watched their car pull away from my curb, watched it disappear around the corner just as it had 2 years ago when they'd moved away to their dream life. And I went back inside my little house and closed the door on that chapter of my life with a finality that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next few days were strange and quiet. I kept expecting to feel something dramatic, triumph or vindication or even regret, but what I felt instead was a kind of peaceful exhaustion, like I'd been carrying something impossibly heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. And now that my hands were empty, I didn't quite know what to do with them. Patricia called to inform me that the legal transfer of assets to the charitable beneficiaries would proceed as scheduled, but that as trustee I had the right to retain a portion for my own needs and comfort. Beatrice had apparently anticipated this possibility, had written provisions that ensured the surviving matriarch would be cared for regardless of what happened with ungrateful heirs. The amount Patricia suggested I keep would be more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to fix everything in my house that had been breaking for decades, to stop worrying about every penny and every bill. I told her I needed to think about it, but the truth was I already knew I didn't want to keep much. The money had never been the point for me, not when I'd earned it cleaning offices, not when I'd given it away to Richard, not now when it was suddenly abundant. What mattered was knowing that Beatrice's wealth would go to places where it could do real good, could help people who needed it the way I'd once needed it, could create opportunities for children who deserved better than what their circumstances had given them. But I did agree to keep enough to take care of myself, because I was beginning to understand that taking care of myself wasn't selfish, that I deserved comfort and security just as much as anyone else, that spending decades in self-sacrifice hadn't made me noble. It had just made me depleted and vulnerable to people who saw that depletion as something they could exploit. The first thing I did with some of that money was call a contractor to fix my house. Within a week, I had people replacing the groaning pipes, installing a new furnace that heated every room evenly without the rattling protests of the old one, patching the roof properly instead of with prayers and hope. I bought myself a new winter coat, soft and warm and the exact shade of blue I'd always loved but never let myself have because it seemed too frivolous, too expensive, too much for someone like me. I also started answering my phone again when Susan called, started saying yes when she invited me for coffee or asked if I wanted to go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I'd been so focused on being available for my family, on keeping my schedule clear in case Richard called or the grandchildren needed something, that I'd let real friendships wither from neglect. Susan didn't seem to hold it against me, though. She just seemed happy to have me back. One afternoon over coffee at the little cafe downtown, Susan asked me directly what had happened, why I'd seemed so sad those weeks back, whether everything was all right with my family. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. But then I realized I was tired of protecting people who hadn't protected me, tired of keeping secrets that only served to hide their cruelty and my pain. So I told her. Not everything. Not the details about the trust or the money, because that felt too personal, too complicated. But I told her about the video call, about being told I wasn't part of their new life anymore, about being blocked and abandoned. I told her how much it had hurt, how it had felt like dying in slow motion. Susan reached across the table and took my hand, and her eyes were bright with tears. "Evelyn," she said, "I'm so sorry. No one deserves that. Especially not you." And then she said something that surprised me. "But maybe, in a strange way, they've given you a gift. They've given you your life back." I thought about that for days afterward. Had they given me my life back? I'd lost my son, my grandchildren, the future I'd imagined where I'd grow old surrounded by family who loved me. But I'd also lost the anxiety of always wondering if I was doing enough, giving enough, being enough. I'd lost the exhaustion of depleting myself for people who took and never seemed satisfied. I'd lost the small, nagging voice that had whispered for years that maybe I wasn't good enough for them, that maybe they tolerated me out of obligation rather than love. And what had I gained? Time for one thing. Time that was suddenly mine to fill however I wanted. I started going back to the community center, volunteering at the food bank on Wednesday mornings, helping sort donations and pack boxes for families who needed help. The woman who ran it, Margaret, remembered me from years ago when I'd volunteered regularly, before Richard's business troubles had consumed all my attention and resources. She welcomed me back with a hug and put me to work immediately, and I found that I loved it, loved the feeling of being useful in a way that was appreciated, loved the conversations with other volunteers who shared stories and laughter over sorting cans and folding clothes. I joined a book club that met at the library every other Tuesday evening. I hadn't read for pleasure in years. Whenever I'd had free time, I'd spent it on the phone with Madison or helping Ethan with his college essays or listening to Richard's work problems. And I'd forgotten how much I loved getting lost in stories, how satisfying it felt to discuss characters and themes and meanings with other people who cared about the same things. I started taking walks in the morning before the day got too warm, looping through the neighborhood I'd lived in for more than half a century, noticing things I'd stopped seeing somewhere along the way. The way the light fell through the oak trees that had been saplings when Thomas and I moved here. The garden that old Mr. Patterson's daughter had planted in his memory, full of roses in every color. The sound of children playing in yards, their laughter floating on the breeze like music. I wasn't happy exactly, not yet, but I was beginning to feel something that might eventually become happiness. Something that felt like the first green shoots pushing through soil that had been frozen for too long. I was beginning to remember who I'd been before I'd made myself so small. Before I'd poured all my energy into being whatever my family needed and forgotten to be anything for myself. Patricia called one morning to tell me that the charitable transfers were complete. $6 million had been distributed according to Beatrice's wishes. Half to children's hospitals in the 3 counties where she'd owned property, a quarter to scholarship funds for first-generation college students, and the remaining quarter split between programs that helped single mothers get education and job training. Patricia had also helped me establish one additional fund, something Beatrice's trust had allowed for. A community center in Willow Creek that would provide after-school programs, job counseling, and support services for families struggling to make ends meet. It would be named after Thomas, a memorial that felt right and true and like something he would have been proud of. "You should know," Patricia said carefully, "that your son has been trying to reach me. He's hired lawyers. They've looked at everything, and they've confirmed what I already told you. There's no way to challenge this. The trust is ironclad. But he asked me to tell you that he wants to talk, that he's sorry, that he hopes someday you might forgive him." I was quiet for a long moment, watching dust motes float in the sunlight streaming through my clean windows. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you're not accepting communication at this time, and that any further attempts to contact you through me would be considered harassment. Was that correct?" "Yes," I said. "That was correct." After we hung up, I sat with my tea and thought about forgiveness. People my age are supposed to forgive, aren't we? We're supposed to be wise and gracious and understanding, supposed to know that life is short and grudges are heavy and family is everything. But I was beginning to think that maybe forgiveness wasn't something you owed to people who hurt you. That maybe it was something you gave yourself. Not by pretending the hurt didn't matter, but by deciding it no longer had the power to define you. I wasn't ready to forgive Richard and Claire and my grandchildren. I might never be ready, but I was ready to stop letting their rejection be the central fact of my existence, to stop organizing my days around the absence of their love, to stop measuring my worth by whether they valued me. I was ready to plant new seeds in the garden of my life and see what grew. The seasons changed the way they always do in Willow Creek, summer fading into autumn with its golden light and crisp mornings, then autumn giving way to winter's quiet beauty. And through it all I changed too, in ways both small and profound, in ways I'm still discovering even now as I sit here telling you this story. It's been almost 2 years since that video call, almost 2 years since I learned about Beatrice and the trust and the future I'd never known existed. And I can tell you honestly that I'm not the same woman I was on that terrible Sunday evening when my world fell apart. The Thomas Harper Community Center opened last spring, a beautiful renovated building that used to be an old warehouse on the edge of downtown. I was there for the ribbon cutting, standing beside the mayor and Patricia and a crowd of people from the neighborhood, who'd come to see what had been built in the name of a man most of them had never met, but who would have loved what his name now represented. There were classrooms for after-school tutoring, a kitchen where single parents could take cooking classes and learn about nutrition on a budget, computers with internet access for job applications and homework, a small gym where kids could play basketball on rainy days. Margaret from the food bank was there, and Susan, and so many other people I'd gotten to know over the past months of volunteering in book clubs and morning walks where I'd stop to chat with neighbors instead of hurrying past with my head down, always rushing to the next thing I had to do for someone else. They all hugged me and told me how proud Thomas would be. And I believed them, believed it in a way I couldn't have believed anything 2 years ago when I was too hollowed out by grief and betrayal to feel much of anything. But standing there in the spring sunshine, watching children run through the center's doors with excitement on their faces, I felt something that might have been joy, or might have been peace, or might have been the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing you've created something good from something painful, that you've transformed loss into legacy. The Scholarship Fund for First-Generation College Students sent me a letter in June with photographs of the first 10 recipients, young people whose faces glowed with hope and determination, whose thank you notes spoke of dreams they hadn't thought were possible until someone believed in them enough to invest in their futures. One girl wrote that she was the first person in her family to attend college, that her mother cleaned houses and her father worked construction, that she'd been planning to skip college and go straight to work until the scholarship made another path possible. I read her letter 3 times, thinking about how I'd cleaned offices and waited tables to put Richard through school, how I'd believed that education was the key to a better life, and how right I'd been even if the person I'd sacrificed for hadn't appreciated it the way I'd hoped. But these students appreciated it. These children at the community center appreciated it. The single mothers learning job skills appreciated it. And their appreciation wasn't about obligation or guilt or keeping me happy. It was pure gratitude for an opportunity they'd been given. And somehow that made it mean more than any thank you I'd ever received from my own family. I still got Christmas cards from Richard and his family. They started arriving that first Christmas after everything happened. Expensive cards with professional family photos, everyone dressed in matching outfits and smiling at the camera with the kind of perfection that requires a professional photographer and multiple takes. There was never a handwritten note, just their printed names at the bottom: Richard, Claire, Madison, and Ethan, and an address I could write back to if I chose. I didn't choose. I put the cards in a drawer without responding, the same drawer where I'd put the second and third cards when they arrived in subsequent years. I wasn't trying to punish them by not responding. Wasn't playing some game where I withheld affection to make them suffer. I simply had nothing to say to them. No bridge I wanted to rebuild, no relationship I wanted to resurrect from ashes they'd created and scattered themselves. Susan asked me once if I missed them, and I had to think about my answer because it wasn't as simple as yes or no. Did I miss the grandson who'd called me an embarrassment? No, I didn't miss him at all. Did I miss the little boy Ethan had been? The child who'd held my hand and asked me to read him stories? Yes, I missed that child terribly, but that child was gone, had grown into someone I didn't recognize, and you can't miss what no longer exists. I missed the relationship I'd thought we had, missed the family I'd believed in, but I didn't miss the reality of people who'd valued me only for what I could give them and discarded me the moment they thought they didn't need me anymore. What I'd learned, what I was still learning, was that missing something doesn't mean you should go back to it, that nostalgia for a past that probably wasn't as good as you remember it doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your present peace. My house felt different now, felt like mine in a way it hadn't for years. The new furnace hummed quietly instead of rattling. The pipes delivered hot water without complaint. The roof didn't leak when it rained. I'd painted the living room a soft sage green I'd always loved, had bought new curtains that let in plenty of light, had arranged my furniture to suit myself rather than to accommodate guests who never came. I'd turned Richard's old bedroom into a craft room where I'd taken up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. And the guest room where the grandchildren used to sleep was now a reading nook with a comfortable chair and shelves full of books I actually wanted to read. I had dinner parties sometimes, small gatherings of the friends I'd made or reconnected with, Women mostly around my age who'd lived full lives and had stories to tell and didn't need me to be anything other than myself. We cooked together and laughed together, and shared both joys and sorrows without judgment or expectation. Margaret came, and Susan, and Patricia sometimes, and a woman named Dorothy from book club who'd lost her husband around the same time I lost Thomas and understood what it meant to rebuild a life from loneliness. These women became my family in ways I hadn't expected, became the people I called when I had good news or needed help or just wanted to hear a friendly voice. They remembered my birthday and checked on me when I had a cold, and invited me to their own celebrations and gatherings. They didn't need my money or my sacrifice. They just needed my company, my presence, the particular self I brought to their lives that was valuable simply because it was me. I learned that family isn't only about blood, that the people who show up for you when you're struggling matter more than the people who share your DNA, but disappear when you're no longer useful to them. I learned that love shouldn't hurt this much, shouldn't cost this much, shouldn't require you to drain yourself dry to prove your worth. I learned that I was enough just as I was, with my old-fashioned stories and my small-town ways and my modest house in a neighborhood that would never be gated or exclusive or impressive to people who measured worth by marble countertops and country club memberships. One afternoon last month, I was sitting on my front porch with Susan, drinking iced tea and watching the world go by, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of my house. My heart jumped despite myself. Some part of me still braced for Richard to appear, still expected another confrontation or plea or attempt to change what couldn't be changed. But the woman who got out of the car was a stranger, young and professional looking, carrying a folder. She introduced herself as a journalist writing an article about Beatrice Langford and the legacy she'd left, about how her trust fund was still changing lives decades after her death. She'd spoken to the hospitals and the scholarship recipients and the community center, and now she wanted to speak to me, to the woman who'd honored Beatrice's wishes and made sure her wealth went exactly where she'd intended it to go. I invited her in and made tea, because that's what you do, isn't it, even after everything? And I told her about Thomas and about Beatrice and about the trust that had existed in secret for so long. I didn't tell her about Richard and the betrayal and the disinheritance, because that was private pain I didn't need to share with the world, but I told her about the joy of seeing Beatrice's money do good things, help people who needed it, create opportunities and hope. The journalist asked me at the end if I had any regrets, and I thought about that question carefully before answering. Did I regret giving so much to Richard? Did I regret the years of sacrifice and struggle and self-depletion? Did I regret trusting people who hadn't deserved that trust? No, I told her finally. I don't regret the giving. I regret that they didn't value it, that they thought love and loyalty could be bought, and then discarded when convenient. But I don't regret being the kind of person who gives, who loves, who believes families should take care of each other. I just learned that sometimes the family you choose is more real than the family you're born with. And that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. She wrote that down in her notebook, and when the article came out a few weeks later, that quote was the one she highlighted, the one other people apparently responded to, because I got letters from strangers who said they'd been through similar experiences, who said my story gave them permission to set boundaries with family members who drained them, who said they'd thought they were alone in their pain until they read about mine. I answered every single one of those letters, because I understood what it meant to feel alone, to feel like your hurt was shameful or wrong or something you should just get over for the sake of keeping peace. I wanted those strangers to know they weren't alone, that their pain was valid, that they had every right to protect themselves even from people who were supposed to love them. Tonight, as I sit here in my cozy living room with its sage green walls and comfortable furniture and shelves full of books, I feel something I haven't felt in years. I feel content. Not deliriously happy, not without moments of sadness or loneliness or wondering what might have been, but content in a deep, settled way that feels like coming home after a long journey. I'm 84 years old now, and I have no idea how many years I have left, but I know this. I'll spend them surrounded by people who value me, doing work that matters, living in a space that brings me peace. I'll spend them being enough, just as I am, without apologies or explanations or desperate attempts to earn love from people who've already shown me they're not capable of giving it. Sometimes, late at night, I take out those Christmas cards and look at the photos of my grandchildren growing older, wonder what they're doing, whether they ever think of me with anything other than resentment or regret. But then I put the cards away and remind myself that I can wish them well from a distance, can hope they've learned something from all this, can release them to live their lives without me just as they released me to live mine without them. Some words can't be taken back, it's true. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. But some endings, painful as they are, make space for new beginnings. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to let go of people who've already let go of you. I've learned to live without their love. More than that, I've learned to live with my own self-love that doesn't depend on being needed, that doesn't require sacrifice to prove its worth, that simply exists because I'm here, I'm alive, and I deserve kindness even from myself. Especially from myself. And that, dear listener, is a lesson that came late but came true, and I'm grateful for it every single day.